10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 348. Hey everybody, welcome back into episode 348 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. It's pretty crazy to think that we're almost to episode 350 of this show. When I first started it, I had no idea that all of your incredible support and listenership would get us to this point. So I'm really excited for episode 350. That's a pretty big milestone. So this week we're going to continue our series on Thelonious Monk, and we're going to look at one of his compositions this week. I think it would be remiss of me to not focus on his composing a little bit, because after all, I think he is one of the greatest jazz composers who ever lived. But before we jump into the show, just wanted to remind you the reason that we've been able to get all the way almost to 350 episodes is through the support of listeners just like you. This is a listener-supported show, which means we don't do any advertisements. We rely on people like you to keep the show going. And we do that in the form of a small monthly donation. And in return for that, you do get PDFs and audio examples for every single episode. We use the Patreon platform for that. So you can go to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, or you can go to Patreon and just search for 10-Minute Jazz Lesson. Quick shout out to a couple of new patrons this week. Thank you to our new $5 patron, Nigel, and thank you to our new $3 patron, Eric. And of course, to the over 350 people we have over there supporting the show. Thank you very much. You are the reason this keeps coming out week in and week out in high quality. So again, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, get yourself signed up today. All right, so I mentioned that we wanted to work on one of Monk's compositions. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, there's so many beautiful compositions. Round Midnight, Ask Me Now, all of these just masterpieces of jazz. But I think I'm going to surprise you a little bit. I want to look at the tune Blue Monk, which of course is just a B-flat blues. And you might be thinking to yourself, oh, you had the pick of so many of these tunes. But I think that, first of all, Blue Monk is really genius, and we're going to talk about why. And then second, I want to talk about something that's a little bit more simple as sort of a gateway into thinking about the compositions of Monk. And then, you can work your way into some of those more complicated tunes, because he did write some extremely complicated tunes that are just genius, but there's a lot more there. And I think looking at Blue Monk is going to give us a little bit of a view into the cleverness of Monk. And I think that's a great word. I think that Monk was one of the most clever composers who ever lived, not just in jazz, in music in general. And he does these really, really simple things that make a huge impact on the way that his compositions come across to the listener. And I think that Blue Monk is just like a perfect encapsulation of this. And we'll talk about some of these little clever things that he's done over this tune. So, as you know, it is a 12-bar blues or in the key of B flat. And this is a tune that everybody should know, like absolutely everybody. This was one of the first tunes that I learned, and I still play it all the time on gigs. This is just a really great composition. So if we start from the very, very beginning, and we're going to break down a couple of the things that I think are the most important and the most clever. So before we get into the first device that he's using, I want to mention a little bit of history about Monk. So in the early 1940s, he was actually the house pianist at Minton's Playhouse in New York City. And after hours at this club was a gathering place and jam session for the early bebop musicians. So people like Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Christian, Kenny Clark, Charlie Parker. Miles Davis was even there when he started playing with Charlie Parker. So we have to think about Monk's like early career and some of his roots as being firmly rooted in bebop. Now, I know most of us associate Monk with bebop, but if you don't, you have to realize that this was some of the early styles that Monk was a huge contributor to. Was the heyday of bebop, when these musicians were starting to figure out this new style of playing. And if you really look closely at the music of Thelonious Monk, there's a lot of bebop elements. And the reason that I bring this up is because I believe that the first little thing that we're going to talk about is this really, really cool combination of a bebop device along with something that takes a nod from the more traditional blues. And it is the opening phrase of Blue Monk. So what he does in the first two bars is he plays this phrase. And what that is actually very, very simple. It's chromatically going from the third up to the fifth of the chord in the first measure, and then the chord in the second measure. So in the first measure, we have a B flat 7 concert chord, and he's going D chromatically up to F. Then, of course, in the second bar, the chord changes to concert E flat 7, and he does the exact same thing. He starts on G and goes chromatically up to B flat. Okay. Now, we also see this happen in bars 5 and 6, but it's a little bit different there. So in bar 5, of course, we have an E flat 7 chord, and he does the same thing. He goes from the third up to the fifth. And then he does something really interesting. He realizes that the fifth to the seventh over that same E flat 7 chord is another minor third. So he goes chromatically from the fifth, B flat, up to the flat 7, D flat. So we see that used 4 times in 12 bars. 4 out of the 12 bars are those little chromatic passing phrases. And then again in bar 5 and 6. And again, that's like a very bebop thing to do. But I also love the fact that if you play this tune a little bit slower, it sounds very bluesy to do that as well. So just a beautiful, genius combination of a very bebop-esque thing, and then also making it sound very bluesy at the same time. Now, you could directly take that idea and you could practice it over a bunch of chords, getting chromatically between chord tones, 1 and 3, 3 and 5, 5 and 7, and even 7 and 9, depending on the chord. And that would be a great thing to practice. We could pull that directly from the first statement of Blue Monk, which I think is great. All right, let's look at our second thing. And this happens in bar 3 and 4, and then it also happens 3 more times. So in bar 3, we see this phrase where he goes like this. We'll play it again. Now, what I think is really, really, really cool about this is that right in the middle of bar 3, on beat 3, we see him go from a concert E flat all the way down to a concert F. Okay, that's the interval of a seventh, of a flat 7. Now, this, I think, gets us into the mind of Monk a little bit, where he just does these little unexpected things that surprise and delight you. Because let's think about this for a second. If he wanted that phrase, if he knew he wanted that F on the end of 3, he could have just gone like this. So you see what I did? I put the F right next to the E flat. I put it above it. Isn't that interesting? But Monk chose to put it down so that it interrupts the line in this really cool way, sort of makes you sit up in your chair and go, what was that? And I think this is just an example of the genius where it's like, okay, I'm going to move this one note and it's going to give you a completely different experience. It's going to make you really pay attention because you know that something is going on here. So again, how can you use this in your own playing? Well, think about your intervallic structure. Are you always doing the thing that makes the most sense? And if you are, you might want to think about displacing some things. Try going in an unexpected direction. There's really, really cool things that can happen when you just start moving notes around by octaves or thinking about things from a different angle. And Monk is proof of that. I mean, that phrase sounds totally different there than it does here. And I would argue it's a big part of what makes Blue Monk sound the way that it does. And then what he does with this phrase, and the third thing that we're going to talk about, is, again, he plays it again in measure 7, right? And then he plays it again in measure 10. But then something really cool happens. And again, it's just this very Monk way of thinking where he's playing the phrase again. This is the 4th time that we're going to have heard this phrase. But what he does in measure 10 is he plays it where it has been, right on beat 1. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. But then he finishes off the tune by just displacing it by 1 beat, which is just so genius. So if we look at the last 4 bars, it is 1, 2, 3, 3, 4, 1. Which is just awesome. It's just shifted over by a beat. But again, it's just this little tiny thing that he does that is like a defining characteristic of this tune that just makes it so brilliant. Okay. So those are the 3 things that you could think about, thinking about going between chord tones chromatically, all the things that you can do with that, up, down, whatever you want. And then you can think about displacing octaves. So interrupting a line that you would normally play by just shifting the octave that one of your notes is in. And then displacing rhythmic figures, okay? Moving something that you would play on 1 over to beat 2. What would happen? Move it over to beat 3. What would happen? Now, I know this episode's getting kind of long, but one more thing I want you to think about that makes this tune so incredible. You could play it at kind of any tempo. Right? I've played it a lot at a really, really slow boo boo doo da, boo boo doo da, and it works really beautifully at that tempo. And then Monk played it a lot. And I think that's the sign of a really great tune too. Is just like you could play it at any tempo and it's still just as effective. So hopefully you enjoyed this episode. I know that I could have chosen so many different tunes, but I chose this one. This one really came to mind because I think it's such an interesting tune. And this is something that I teach a lot of my students. And I think it provides a gateway into some of his more complicated tunes. But I'd love to hear what you think about it. If any of this stuff helped you. And remember, you can grab the PDF where I highlight all of this stuff that we talked about by going to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, clicking on one of the Patreon banners, and choosing to support this show. Thank you to everybody over there that's been doing that for weeks, months, and years. We really appreciate you and could not do this show without you. And we will see you next week with a brand new episode. Hope you're all doing well out there, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.